Last week we looked at chapter 39 and we seen the destruction of Gog's army, which we know will be the battle of Armageddon. And the slaughter of Gog's army will be so great that it will take the burial team 7 months to bury all the dead people. Tonight we're going to begin a summary of the last 9 chapters of the book, as there is a lot of measurements of the temple, the city, and the giving of the land. The book comes to its close with a vision of the future Israel, with a renewed temple at its center. This vision is of the millennial city, the city of the end times. The temple itself is described in chapters 40 through 43, verse 9. Regulations for the community's life are then given in chapter 43, verse 10 through 46, verse 24. And finally, wrapping up the book of Ezekiel as the vision expands to the whole land of Israel. Chapters 40 through 48 was written later than all the prophecies of the book, except for chapter 29, verses 17 through 21. The vision recorded in this section continued the theme of the hope of restoration that began in chapter 33. So in chapter 33, we began this section of the restoration of hope. This hope of restoration, that God is giving the people hope that life will be restored to what He had given them back all the way back in Moses' time when they entered the Promised Land. So chapters 40 through 48 presented the realization of hope with a focus on a new temple and the reinstituted offerings. In chapter 40, verse 1 through 42, verse 20 is the vision of the restored temple. A sanctuary for worship was associated with Israel from the foundation of its existence, as seen in Exodus chapter 33, verse 7 through 11. So all the way back when Moses is leading the Israelites wandering through the wilderness, God gave Moses this vision. He told Moses, hey, you need to build a temple, this building. They didn't build it out of blocks. They didn't build it out of lumber. They built it out of what we might call curtains and things, because it had to be portable. They had to be able to carry it through the wilderness, because then they lived in tents. So it was more of a tent than anything. And they traveled around, and when they would stop and set up camp for a while, they would set up this makeshift tabernacle or this makeshift sanctuary or temple, and that's where they would go in and worship. The tabernacle that was constructed in the wilderness as a visible sign of the Mosaic covenant was a forerunner of the permanent sanctuary, the temple, both in precedent and design. So that was what was seen then would be the temple that was built later, and now the future temple that will be built at the end of time. This is the temple, the vision of the temple that we see in chapters 40 on through. It is not a temple that will be built in Ezekiel's time, but a future temple that will be built at the end of time. In chapter 40, verse 1, we are given a final date, a final prophecy date. It says, in the 5 and 20th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after that, the city was smitten. And the selfsame day the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me hither. This is the final dated prophecy of the book. The date of this prophecy for our timing or our calendar that we would look at it would be April 19th, 573 BC, which is the 25th year of their exile. This is 25 years that Ezekiel has been in exile. 25 years that the people of Israel have been in exile. Verse 2 then, he says, "In the vision of God brought he me into the land of Israel, and set me upon a high mountain, by which was as the frame of a city on the south." The very high mountain is a reference to Mount Zion. Mount Zion is considered the Temple Mount. It is where the temple will be built at Jerusalem. It is a very mountain that is fought over even to this day. I believe the Muslims have control over it at this time. But it will be back into Israel's control, and Israel will build a temple on that mountain at the end of times. Then the rest of chapter 40 through 42, we are given the proportions of the temple, where the gates are, the inner courts, the measurements, and so forth. These are revealed in great detail as were those of the tabernacle to Moses in Exodus chapter 25, verse 1 through 31, verse 17. The care for such detail comes from a concern to deal properly with holy things. The pattern is not quite like either the tabernacle or the temple of Solomon. For example, the rooms for the priest, north and south of the temple courtyard, are new. So there's some new things about the new temple. There's some new details. You know, it's like when you build a new building for your church. You might take and build it a little similar, but you're going to add some new things. You want it to be a little bit different, but you might keep some things similar. On the handout, the first slide, I built slides just because it's a little easier to point some things out. On the handout, with the first one, it says, it should be the first page that's stapled together. It says the gate to the millennial temple. In chapter 40, verses 6 through 12, we are given measurements for these gates. Now on your handout, those measurements are actually in feet. And you'll see there, it says dimensions are in feet. So these are in feet. In the Bible, it's going to give it to you in cubits. He used a rod to measure the lengths. So their rod he used was to measure the lengths of the temple and the lengths of these different areas. But this was the gate to the millennial temple. This was a gate leading up to the temple. We'll get to the whole temple as a whole in just a few minutes. On the second page, we see that says the millennial temple proper. You will see a room that has IS in the middle of it. So right up here at the very top, we see there, I put in red, most holy place. In the Old Testament. In Exodus, and when Moses was given the details of this, they called it the Holy of Holies. During the Exodus, the wilderness wandering, there we heard it called the Holy of Holies. This is where the priest, man, they had to be ceremonially clean beyond clean. And when they went into that area, they could go into the outer sanctuary here, and they could be okay. But before they entered that area right there, before they went through that doorway right there, to get into the inner sanctuary, the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, they tied a rope around their ankle. So that way, and a bell, they put a bell on them. And if that bell quit ringing for a certain amount of time, they'd grab that rope and drag them out because they died. And generally it meant they weren't ceremonially clean enough to be in there. And only the high priests were allowed to go in there. Regular priest could go into the outer sanctuary, but only the high priest. But the millennial temple, we'll see in a little bit, do not have that. Chapter 41, verse 4 says, "So he measured the length thereof 20 cubits, and the breadth 20 cubits, before the temple. And he said unto me, This is the most holy place." A cubit, we see there, I put on the side there, a cubit is 1.75 feet, or roughly 21 inches. A cubit, it's going to all depend on whose measurement you're going by. But roughly 21 inches is a cubit, not foot like we would measure, but a cubit measurement from the Bible times. So this right here is 20 foot by 20 foot, or 20 cubit by 20 cubit, which is 35 by 35 foot wide. So it's a 35 by 35 square place, building, room. Then on the third handout, we see the view of the whole temple, an upper view, if you will. Aerial view, thank you. If you look at this darker area right here with the T in the very center, that is what we were just looking at. This right here. This is right there where my dot is where the Holy of Holies was at. So this right here is the sanctuaries, the outer sanctuary, the inner sanctuary. These are the courts, the outer courts, the inner court. Chapter 40, verse 26 says, "And there were 7 steps to go up to it, and the arches thereof were before them, and it had palms, one on this side and another on that side, and upon the post thereof." He's talking about the gates to get into the outer gates. There were 7 steps to leading up these gates. There was palms on either side. Then in verse 34 of chapter 40, he talks about the inner gates. There he says, "And the arches thereof were toward the outer court, and palm trees were upon the post thereof, on the sides, on this side and on that side, and the going up it had 8 steps." So the outer gates had 7 steps. The inner gates, there's 3 of each, 3 outer gates, 3 inner gates. Each had the outer gates 7 steps, the inner gates 8 steps. Why they added 1 extra step, I'm not really sure, but they did. Then we have the priest chambers. There's 4 of them. 1 little one, 1 big one on each side. He talks about them in chapter 42, verses 13 and 14. He says, "Then said he unto me, The north chambers and the south chambers, which are before the separate place, they be holy chambers, where the priests that approach unto the Lord shall eat the most holy things. There shall they lay the most holy things, and the meat offerings, and the sin offerings, and the trespass offerings, for the place is holy." So that's where they would go to prepare for sacrifices and different things. Chapter 43, 1 through chapter 46, 24, talks about the renewed temple in place. It is time for the glory of God to return to his dwelling place, which he had left because of its corruption. We seen that back in chapter 8, I believe it was, or 8 through 12, somewhere in there. God had gotten sick of the absolute disgrace of the people, their idolatry, and their misuse of the temple. And he brought Ezekiel into the temple, and he has him standing there. And he shows him, he shows Ezekiel that he leaves. His presence leaves the temple, and he goes out. He goes out and he passes over the Mount of Olives, and he leaves the temple. Now if we were to sit here and read the whole story, we see that God's presence would come back across the Mount of Olives into the temple. Chapter 43, 1 through 5. I forgot I put it in here. It says there, afterward he brought me to the gate, even the gate that looketh toward the east. This one down here would be the east gate. And behold, the glory of God of Israel come from the way of the east, and his voice was like a noise of many waters, and the earth shined with his glory. And it was according to the appearance of the vision which I saw, even according to the vision that I saw when I came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the visions that I saw by the river Chabar, and I fell upon my face. And the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate whose prospect is toward the east. So the Spirit took me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. So here God brings Ezekiel to the east side of the city where the Mount of Olives lies, just across the Kidron Valley from the Temple Mount. And as Ezekiel looked toward the east, where the glory of the Lord had departed in the vision of chapters 8 through 11, he saw God's glory return, accompanied by the sound of rushing waters. This was what he says that is what God's voice sounded like to him, was the sound of rushing waters. It was apparent to Ezekiel that the Lord's coming was not a summons to ministry or a sign of judgment. He says, this time, God's not summoning me. He's not calling me to ministry. This time, or he's not telling me that judgment's coming. This time, it was a sign of his covenant love, bringing blessings to his people that would never be taken away again. This is the end times. This is millennial reign. This is at the very end of time. This isn't, next year. This is the millennial reign. This is blessings that are coming back to his people. Ezekiel's response was the same as in his first encounter with God's glory. He fell on his face. Ezekiel comes into God's presence, or God's presence comes to Ezekiel, and he falls on his face in reverence and respect. But the Spirit picks him up and brought him into the inner court. He brings him into the inner court right here. This little spot right here is the altar. God brings him to this area. And Ezekiel watched God's glory enter back into to where he had departed. The vision continues with instructions for an altar and sacrifice, priesthood, and the prince and annual festivals. In 43, 13 through 17, we see the measurements of the altar, which is on our next page. I've never examined or looked at or even pictured the altar before. That thing is 19 and a quarter feet tall. 19 feet 3 inches tall, according to our measurements. That's a pretty big, by 31 feet, 31 foot, 31 and a half feet wide at the base, 21 foot wide at the very top. That's a pretty good size altar, man. That's pretty good size. That's almost as big as our stage to have an altar. I mean, it's a whole lot taller than our altar or our stage, but the 21 foot across, I mean, that's pretty good size. Ezekiel's program provides for all the elements of Israel's religious life that the Old Testament law codes did. The priests, the Levites are to occupy an area around the temple in the middle of the land, as seen in chapter 45, 1 through 6. The prince also has holding alongside the priestly land, seen in chapter 45, 7 through 8. There are rules for atonement, feast, a Passover, unleavened bread, and the Sabbath. And Ezekiel's Israel, in other words, the end time, millennial reign, priest and prince govern the religious life. Ezekiel himself is the only prophetic figure like Moses in Deuteronomy. There are no high priest. We know in the New Testament, we're told that Jesus is the only high priest. And the king has become a prince, which makes him like a tribal chief from Mosaic times. The new temple will become the visible reminder of Israel's relationship to God through his new covenant. Since God gave detailed instruction for the building the tabernacle to occupy his inauguration of the Mosaic covenant, it is not unusual that he would also supply detailed plans for his new center of worship to occupy the implements of the new covenant. This is the temple that will be built at the end of times and will have animal sacrifices once again performed in it, just as was done back in the Old Testament as commanded and followed through the laws that were given through Moses. In the last section, in chapter 47 and 48, Ezekiel is led out of the temple. He sees a river flowing out from God's presence. The water was coming out from under the threshold of the temple. Zechariah also records something similar, but in Ezekiel only sees one river, where Zechariah sees the river split and divide as it leaves Jerusalem, with half flowing east toward the Dead Sea, as Ezekiel did, and half flowing westward toward the Mediterranean. Zechariah 14:8 is where we see that in Zechariah's account. It says, "And it shall be in that day that living water shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and in winter shall it be." As Ezekiel follows the river out of Jerusalem, the waters get deeper and deeper, as seen in 47, 3 through 5. In verses 6 through 12, Ezekiel comes to the riverbank. As it has gotten too deep to walk in, he gets back out of the water, and he sees many trees on each side of the river. These waters will produce beautiful vegetations along the riverbanks. Then in 47 verse 8, he's telling us about this river. And he says there, "Then said he unto me, These waters issue out toward the east country, and go down into the desert. Go into the sea, which being brought forth into the sea, the water shall be healed." Here we see the waters flow toward the east and go down into the desert and go into the sea, that being the Dead Sea. This river bringing life will heal the sea, as verse 8 says here. As this new river that is flowing from the new temple, from the presence of God, will enter the Dead Sea, the waters there will become fresh water. The Dead Sea right now is 6 times saltier than the oceans of the world. But once the waters of this new river flowing out of the temple from the throne of God, the waters will flow to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea will become completely salt-free. Truly a miracle from God. This now lifeless body of water, no life can be sustained in the Dead Sea. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. The now lifeless body of water will then support life, so that wherever the river flows, everything will live. God promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Palestine, and the promise has never been revoked. Israel's experiencing blessings in the land was conditioned on her obedience, but her right to possess the land has never been revoked. Israel, their ability to get blessings from God was conditioned on their obedience to God. But their right to possess the land has never been revoked. They were brought out of the land because they were being revoked of a blessing, but they were never revoked the covenant of the land, the right to the land. Our last handout is a map, the map of Israel, the map of the promised land, the land given to Israel. The land will be distributed according to the tribes of Israel. We see all the different names listed all the way down. There's 7 on the north side of the city of Jerusalem, of the division of the prince's portions, the Levites and the priest's portion, and then there's 5 more. Yeah, 5 more on the bottom, on the south side. On the last slide, which you don't have it is the little circle there. I blowed it up some for you. Is the little circle, which is the prince's portions on the sides. This is the city of Jerusalem. That little square right there is the temple. The priest's portion of land is around it. The Levites' portion is to the north of it. This is the city land. This is the Dead Sea. This is the River Jordan coming out of the top of it. The River Jordan flows south out of the Sea of Galilee into the Dead Sea. Ezekiel's vision, therefore, does more than foresee a rebuilding of the temple. It affirms God's life-giving power of all creation because he dwells in Zion. The tribal allotments are divided schematically in east-west parallels, proceeding from north to south. The order of the tribes partly follows the birth order of Jacob's sons. Through the sons of the slave women have been given lesser portions, though the slave women have been given lesser portions. So that's chapters 40 through 48 in a summary, in a nutshell. If we were to take these and go through them like we have the other 39 chapters, it would kind of become very redundant, because you got, this gate is, and all 3 of the gates are the same measurements. So when you go through all the gates, they're all the same measurements. So it would just be over and over and over doing the same measurements over and over and over again, and can become very boring, I guess. So don't forget, the 16th of September, we're starting Experiencing God. If you have not signed up to get a workbook, please do so we can make sure everybody gets one. Yes. Huh? She was the first one. She was the most obedient one. She was the first one. You was the second. She just beat you to it.
Well, I want you to know I'm signed up for it. I hope Jean said she did.
She signed you up. She was obedient.
I was in my early 20s.
I don't know if it's been around no 50 years, Miss Sandy.
Check it out.
I don't think Henry Blackleby's that old now, Miss Henry, or Miss Sandy.
Well, when it's a review of what
I'm just giving you a hard time.
I just want to see how much it's changed, or if I remember.
They've revised it, because his son worked on it with him and revised it.
Okay.
So it may, Henry, I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
That's all right. I was just curious.
Now I heard his son Richard Blackaby at actually one of our associational meetings 2 years ago, I think it was. So, all right.